When Paul writes this, he's writing in a genre that was present in the ancient world. You can find secular text with these kinds of codes. Wives do this, husbands do that, children do this, masters do that. And in some ways, it's not surprising. Paul was, after all, a product of the first century. So when he's doing the kinds of things that people in his world did, it's not all that surprising. What is surprising is when he pushes back against the cultural assumptions of the world he lived in. And in this text, there's some very specific places, and you may have already begun to notice them, where he very much pushes back against the cultural assumptions of the world in which he lived. Can you imagine what it might have been like for what was it? Pater familias. Everybody remember what that means? Father of the family, head of the household. Can you imagine Paul telling the head of a Roman household who has authority of life and death over his children, fathers, do not embitter your children or they will become discouraged. You think anybody in the Roman Empire in the father space would have thought that's good advice? I mean, after all, if you have power of life and death, you call the shots. You do what I say. If you don't like it, well, some folks' parents used to take them to the woodshed. You'd be relieved if that's all it was if you lived in the Roman Empire, because it could be a lot worse. And so Paul takes men in Colossae who assume they have almost unlimited authority over the lives of the people in their homes and says, don't provoke your children. You're not the dictator of your house. Don't embitter them. And he says, when it comes to your wives, don't treat them harshly. I guarantee you there were plenty of men in the Roman Empire who thought their right as citizens granted them the privilege of treating their wives harshly if they wanted to. It is a stunning thing to have a letter written by Paul where he challenges that. And we begin to see the extent to which he challenges it when we get to the part about slaves. Because if a slave in your house crossed you, pater familias, you could do whatever you wanted and pretty much nobody was going to ask any questions. You could throw them out, you could end their life, it's your call. And so for Paul to come and say, masters, provide your slaves with what is right and fair. Why? Because you have a master in heaven. He is leveling the playing field in a way no one else in the first century was doing. Nobody told the pater familias, you have a master. And so when we bring this whole household code, as it's called, together, keeping in mind that Paul has just told them over all the virtues of compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Those are the virtues that he calls on them to embody. Kindness, humility, gentleness, patience. Bear with one another, forgive one another. And he says, over all of these things, 3:14, put on love. And then when he gets to the instructions for the household, we begin to realize he's calling upon members of Roman households to be ruled by love, not their rights. Isn't that a wild conception? What if a Christian household isn't governed by who has rights, What if it's governed by the question of who embodies the perfect love of Jesus in the spousal relationship? Notice how each member of the household he addresses is invited to look to the needs of whom? The other person in the counterpart relationship. So wives, look to whom? The husband. Husbands, look to the interests of whom? The wives. Children, look to the interests of whom? Somebody else. Your own interests? No. Someone else's, your parents. Fathers, look to the interests of whom? Your children. Slaves, look to the interests of your masters. Masters, pay attention to the interests of your slaves. And no one is invited to look out for number one, are they? Why? Because Paul expects a Christ-oriented community to embody other-oriented love. And when he gets to the place where he applies that to the household, it means every member shows up saying, I'm not so worried about my rights or my privileges. I'm looking for ways to embody the character of Jesus in relationship to my household.